Wind River Country, Wyoming Territory. 2 summers gone without rain and a whole valley dying of the thirst. The camera comes down off the high gray peaks, down over creek beds cracked like old crockery, down to a scatter of buildings hugging a brown river, and a saloon at the end of the only street, its lamps burning yellow against the dark. Inside by the stove sit the most dangerous-looking men in the territory. Hard hands, long silences, beards gone gray with hard winters. And then the door opens. Not a shove, not a kick. Slow. The way a door opens when whoever's pushing has nothing left. A little girl, 10 years old, barefoot in a storm, soaked to the bone and shaking and one eye swollen near shut. She walked 3 miles through the freezing dark to stand in that doorway. The whole room goes still. Her lips move. Nothing comes. And then 4 small words in a voice that is barely there at all. My pa did this. The rain came down on the Wind River Country like the sky had a grudge. A 10-year-old girl was walking through it, barefoot, 3 miles of freezing dark toward a room full of the most dangerous men in the territory. And when she finally pushed open that door and stood there dripping, she would say 4 words that stopped that whole room cold. But that comes later. First there was the rain, and first there was the bear. That was the name they used for him. In Coldwater, in the saloons, in the church pews, in the whispered talk of children who'd never once laid eyes on him. The bear of black antler, a man the size of a barn door, a beard gone silver as a winter wolf, hands that folks swore could snap a rifle stock the way you'd snap a dry twig. His name was Zebulon Corliss. Most had forgotten that. He'd near forgotten it himself. He came down once a year, when the aspens turned to beaten gold and the high passes still held open. When the marten and the wolf and the fox had grown their thick winter coats, and a man could trade a hard season of hides for powder and lead and coffee and salt. He came down because a body needs salt, not because a body needs people. People Zeb had decided a long time ago were the one thing in this world he could do without. He rode a mule the color of old smoke. Behind him a string of pack animals walked heavy with pelts. The trail dropped down out of the timber switchback after switchback, and there it was below him in the dusk. Coldwater, a scatter of buildings hugging the Sweetwater River, a church with a crooked steeple, a bank, a long low row of stores. And at the head of the street, bright and new and out of place, a land office with a fresh coat of white paint that had cost more than most folks in that valley would see in a year. Zeb looked at that bright new paint a long moment, and something in his gut turned over slow. Because he knew who had paid for it. Everyone knew who had paid for it. They just didn't say the name out loud. But that's a story for after. For now there was only the rain and the cold and the long way down. He was 53 years old. He felt every one of them in his knees. The valley had gone dry that summer. He'd seen it the whole way down. Creek beds cracked open like old crockery left out in the sun. Cattle gone ribby and slow standing in dust where there ought to have been grass. He passed a homestead where the garden had burned brown to the roots, and a woman stood in the doorway with a baby on her hip and 3 more children behind her skirts, and they all of them watched him ride by with the hollow-cheeked stare of folks who'd stopped expecting the rain to come back. He passed another place where an old man was hauling water by the bucketful up from a mud hole that had been a creek in better years. The old man straightened his back to watch the bear go by, didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched the way a man watches weather he can't do anything about. A dry valley is a hungry valley, and a hungry valley is a frightened one. Zeb didn't care to dwell on it. He didn't come down to dwell on things. He came down to trade and to be gone again before the snow shut the passes behind him. 3 days. That was the plan. Sell the hides, buy the goods, climb back up into the high country where the only voice was the wind in the spruce, and the only debt a man carried was the one he owed himself. 3 days. He almost made it one. The saloon sat at the end of the only street worth the name. Greer's the sign said, though half the letters had peeled away in the weather. It wasn't much. A long room with a low ceiling, a plank bar worn pale and smooth, a pot-belly stove in the corner working hard against the cold and losing the argument. But it was dry. And it had whiskey. And it had Odessa. Odessa Greer ran that place the way a riverboat captain runs a boat, one eye on everything at once, and a hand never far from a length of axe handle she kept below the bar for the nights, Men forgot their manners. She was a widow and had been for years. She'd buried a husband and a soft spot for charming fools in the same hard season, and come out the other side of it harder and kinder, both the way some women do. She saw the bear duck through her low doorway, and she did not flinch. That was the first thing Zeb ever truly noticed about her. Most folks flinched. A man his size coming in out of the dark, soaked and silent, most folks took half a step back without meaning to. Odessa just looked up from the glass she was drying, and one corner of her mouth went up. "Well," she said, "the mountain came to town, came for salt, came in out of the rain like a drowned grizzly more like." She set the glass down. "Sit, before you drip the whole sweet water across my floor." He sat, and that was all of it. A drowned grizzly in a glass set down on a plank bar. But Zeb felt something he hadn't felt in a year. He felt seen, not feared, not gawked at, seen the way you'd look at any tired man who'd come a long, cold way. He didn't have a name for the feeling. He didn't want one. So he wrapped his huge hands around the coffee she poured him, and he said nothing at all. His own men were already there, scattered across 2 tables near the stove. His brigade, what little was left of it. The last of the old breeds, same as him, come down out of the high country for the same trade. Eben Marsh sat nearest the heat, still as a fence post. Eben never used 2 words where one would carry, and never used the one if a nod would do the job. He was Zeb's right hand and had been for 20 winters and a dozen worse nights than this one. If Zeb was the storm, Eben was the keel beneath it. There was gray in his beard now, too, and a stiffness in the way he moved that hadn't been there 10 years back. But his eyes were the same. Steady. Always steady. Across the table from him, Jubal Pryor was carving something small from a scrap of antler, his knife going in slow, patient strokes. Jubal was a black man and a free man, and the finest tracker in the whole Wind River Range bar, none. He had a voice on him, soft as creek water sliding over stone. Folks who didn't know him underestimated him. Folks who did know him knew better. Jubal Pryor could read a day-old track through a rainstorm and tell you a man's height, his hurry, the weight of what he carried, and whether he favored his left leg. Young Rance Tully was at the far table, all elbows and restlessness, and fire, 8 and 20 years old and dead. Certain he understood the whole shape of the world. Rance loved a fight the way other men love a sweetheart. It was going to get him killed someday, and everybody in that brigade knew it. Everybody but Rance. And Lem Stagg. Old Lem. Wiry as a strand of rawhide with a face like a dried apple left out of winter, and a pair of eyes that missed exactly nothing. Lem had been everywhere a man could go, and done most everything a man could do, and he'd forgotten more law than most lawyers would ever learn on account of he'd spent a good piece of his younger years on the wrong side of it, and a man learns the fences best by climbing them. These were Zeb's people, the only ones he had left in all the world. They didn't talk much, the 5 of them. Didn't need to. They sat in the warm and the dry and listened to the rain hammer the roof, and for a little while the world was a small and bearable thing, and the cold was somewhere else outside where it belonged. It did not stay that way. The storm hit harder. The lamps along the wall guttered and steadied. The stove ticked and popped, and then the door opened. Not the way a grown man opens a door. Not a shove or a kick or a confident swing. It opened slow. It opened the way a thing opens when whoever's pushing on it has almost nothing left to push with. And a child came through. A little girl, 10 years old, give or take, soaked clean through to the bone so the rain ran off her in sheets and pooled on the floorboards at her feet. Her hair was plastered dark to her skull. She was barefoot. She wore a nightdress gone gray and thin with washing, and it clung to her, and she was shaking so hard you could see it from across the room. The whole place went still. The piano nobody had been playing seemed to hold its breath. The stove stopped its ticking. Eben's hand went still on his glass. Jubal's knife stopped dead in the middle of a stroke. Because of her face. One eye swollen near shut. A split lip crusted dark. And on the small bones of her on a child's thin arms and a child's thin throat where there ought to have been nothing but freckles and the honest scrapes a child gets from climbing trees, the marks of a grown man's hand. She didn't cry. That was the thing that reached into a man's chest and twisted if he had anything left in there to twist. She didn't cry. She'd gone past crying somewhere out there in the dark and the rain miles back. She just stood, dripping, trembling, looking at a room full of the biggest, hardest, most fearsome-looking men in the whole territory. And Odessa came around that bar so fast, she near took the corner clean off it. "Lord above," she breathed. "Baby." The girl looked at her, then looked past her, at the men, and she opened her mouth. It took her a long time. Her lips moved and nothing came. And then it came in a voice so small it was hardly a sound at all. "My pa did this." 4 words. 4 words, and the whole night cracked down the middle. Zeb did not move. He sat very still on his stool, the way a man holds still when something has reached down into him and taken hold of a thing he'd thought was long dead and buried. Because he knew that voice. Not the girl's. He'd never once heard the girl's voice before this night. He knew the other thing in it, the thing underneath it. The flat, ground-down, given-up quiet of somebody who has learned the hard way over years that telling the truth changes nothing at all. He'd heard that before. A long, long time ago. "No, don't. Don't you go there, old man." But he was already there. He was already standing in a different doorway, in a different town, 15 years gone, looking down at a different girl. His girl, with marks on her that a worthless man had put there. Bury it. That's old country. That's frozen country. Stay here. He shut his eyes for the space of one breath. One. And when he opened them, he was off his stool. He crossed the room. A man that size, you'd think he'd shake the whole floor with every step. He didn't. He moved the way weather moves, slow and certain and quiet. And then he did a thing that not one of his men had ever seen him do. He knelt. He went all the way down slow, the great bulk of him folding low, so that his eyes came level with the child's eyes instead of looming over her like a thundercloud. He held up his hands, showed her the empty palms of them, scarred and huge and open. "Easy," he said. His voice came out lower than he meant it to and gentler. "Easy now. There ain't a soul in this room gonna lay a hand on you. You hear me?" She flinched anyway. She flinched so hard she nearly went over backward into the rain. And Zeb froze. Just froze, hands up, every muscle in his great body locked still. Because the last thing he wanted in all this world was to be one more big thing that frightened her. "All right," he murmured. "All right now, I'll stay right here. I won't come no closer than this. You see my hands? They're gonna stay right where you can watch them." She stared at him out of the one eye she could still open. And something in her face moved. It wasn't trust. Trust was far too much to ask of her. It was something smaller than that and more tired. It was the first weary thought that maybe, just possibly, this one time she wasn't about to be hurt. Odessa came down to her knees beside the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl's voice came thin and careful. "Linnet." "Linnet." Odessa said it gentle like it was a thing made of glass. "Why, that's a little bird. You know that a linnet's a little singing bird." The child looked at her like she had never once in her life been told a kind thing. Maybe she hadn't. Not in a long while. "Linnet what?" Lem asked from across the room. Careful, quiet so as not to spook her. "Stroud." And there it was. Lem's old apple doll face changed in an instant. Just a flicker, but Zeb caught it. Lem looked at Eben. Eben looked back at Lem. Because everybody in Coldwater knew the Strouds. Everybody knew Cleon Stroud. "Linnet, honey." Odessa's voice didn't change a hair, but her hands did, going still and slow and steady. "Did you walk here in all this storm?" A nod. "From your place out on the bench above the river?" Another nod. "Lord above." That was 3 miles. More than 3. 3 miles in the black, in the freezing rain, barefoot, a 10-year-old child in a wet nightdress. Which meant that whatever was behind her was worse than 3 miles of killing storm. Zeb did the arithmetic in his head, and his jaw went hard as iron. "Where's your pa right now, Linnet?" he asked. She looked at the floorboards. "Home," she whispered. "He's sleepin'. He drinks, and then he sleeps real heavy. I waited till he was sleepin'. Then I run." She said it so plainly, so practiced, like it was a thing she had planned, like it was a thing she had been planning a good long while, lying awake in the dark, waiting for the right night, the right amount of whiskey, the right deep and senseless sleep. And that broke something in Zeb that he had genuinely believed was already past breaking. because no child on God's earth ought to have to plan her escape from her own father. Odessa already had a blanket in her hands, a clean wool blanket pulled warm off the rack behind the stove, and she settled it around the girl's thin shoulders, as soft as a thing could be done. She drew a stool up close to the fire. She got the child sitting. She pressed a cup of warm milk into those small, cold hands, sweetened with a good spoon of honey, and Lynette wrapped both hands around that cup and held on to it like it was the first warm thing she had touched in a year. Maybe it was. The men watched. Hard men, every one. Men who had skinned and bled and fought and dug graves with their own hands. And not one of them could find a single thing to say. It was Jubal who finally broke the silence. Soft, like water over stone. "Miss Lynette," he said, "you hungry?" She nodded without lifting her eyes. So Jubal got up and went behind the bar like he owned it, and Odessa let him, and he came back with bread and cold meat on a tin plate and set it down beside her. And then, and here was the true kindness of the man, he turned his back. He set the food down and turned away and busied himself at the stove so that the starving child could eat the way a starving creature eats, fast and graceless and ashamed, without a single soul watching her do it. Zeb stayed kneeling. He didn't rightly know why. His knees were screaming at him. He was 53 years old, and the cold of the long ride was deep in his bones, and every part of his body was telling him to get up off that floor. He stayed kneeling, because something about standing up felt too much like leaving, and he had done enough leaving for one lifetime. The girl ate. The fire popped and settled. The rain came down without mercy on the roof, and then she said the thing. She said it to the cup in her hands, not to anyone in particular. Quiet, the way a child says a thing she has carried so long it's worn smooth as a river stone. "He didn't used to be so bad," she said. "Not when Mama was alive." Odessa went very still. "When did you lose your mama, baby?" she asked. Gentle, so very gentle. 4 years ago. "And how did she pass?" And Lynette went quiet, a long quiet, the kind that has a real weight to it that presses down on a room. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to almost nothing at all. "Everybody says she fell." Zeb felt the hair stand up along the back of his neck. "Everybody says she fell down the loft stairs," Lynette said to the cup. "That's what Pa told the doctor. That's what the doctor wrote down in his book. That's what the preacher said over her at the burying. She fell." A pause. "But I was there." The whole saloon had gone silent as a grave. Even Rance, who couldn't sit still to save his soul, had gone perfectly motionless. "I heard 'em," Lynette whispered. "I heard 'em fightin'. I heard Mama crying. And then I heard something hit the wall real hard. And then there wasn't no more crying. There wasn't no more nothing at all." Her small hands tightened on the cup until the knuckles went white. "And then Pa come into my room, and he told me Mama had an accident, and he told me to go back to sleep. And he told me," her voice cracked just the once, the single crack in the whole flat, hard telling of it. "He told me that if I ever said different to anybody, I'd have an accident too." Nobody breathed. There it was, the first turn of the knife. Not a beaten child, a witness. A little girl who at 6 years old had heard her own mother die through a bedroom wall, and a man who had spent the 4 years since keeping her too frightened to ever say so out loud. Lemstag let a long breath out through his nose. "By the heavens," he said soft. And Zeb was somewhere else again. There is a thing that happens with a deep wound. It heals over on the top. It grows a skin across itself. And you can climb up into the high country and let 15 winters of snow bury it. And you can tell yourself every single morning that it is gone. And then a child can say 4 words. "My pa did this." And the skin splits clean open, and you discover that it never healed at all. It only froze. And it's all still down there, every last bit of it, as raw and red as the day it was made. He saw Tamsin. He pushed her away. Not now, not here. There was a living child in front of him, warm and breathing, and the dead one would keep the way the dead always kept in the cold dark where he stored them. Zeb dragged himself back into the room by main force, the way you haul a boot out of deep mud. He looked at Lynette Stroud eating cold bread by a stove fire, holding her cup like a lifeline. And he made her a promise, not out loud. Out loud was far too much. He had made a promise out loud once before to a different girl and not been there to keep it. He made this one in the only place he had left to make a promise, down deep where the ice had been. Not this one, he thought. Whatever it costs me. Not this one, too. Linnet, Odessa was saying, you are not going back there. You hear me, child. You are not going back to that house tonight. The girl looked up, and the thing that came over her face, it wasn't relief. Zeb had expected relief. It was fear, a worse fear than before. He'll come, Linnet whispered. When he wakes up and finds me gone, he'll come looking, and he'll be so mad. Let him come, said Rance Tully. It was the first thing the boy had said all night, and his hand was already flat on the table, fingers spread ready. Sit down, Rance, Zeb said. Not loud. He never had to be loud. Rance sat, and outside, over the steady drum of the rain, came a new sound. Hoofbeats, hard and fast, splashing up the muddy street. Linnet heard it, and the change that came over her was a terrible thing to watch. She went small. She went tiny. She pulled the wool blanket up to her chin and shrank down into herself like a creature gone to ground, and her one good eye went huge and round and fixed itself on the door. That's him, she breathed. That's Pa. The horse pulled up hard outside. A man came down out of the saddle, none too steady. Boots hit the boardwalk, heavy and uneven, one and then the other, and the door of Greer's saloon banged open against the wall. Cleon Stroud filled the frame of it. He wasn't a tall man, he was a wide one. Thick through the chest and thicker through the gut, the kind of thick that comes from hard labor and harder drinking in equal measure. His face was red with cold and whiskey and a fury that had plainly hauled him up out of his stupor and put him on a horse. Water ran off the curled brim of his hat. His eyes swept the room, the men, the size and the number of them, and just for a heartbeat something careful flickered across his face. Then his eyes found Linnet by the fire. There you are, he said, and Linnet made a sound, a small animal sound high in her throat, and it was the worst sound Zeb had ever heard out of a living thing. Cleon took a step inside. Get up, girl. You got the whole town thinking. He didn't finish, because the bear of Black Antler had stood up. He'd been kneeling low and quiet by the fire. So when he rose, and he kept rising, all 6.5 feet of him, unfolding up out of the lamplight to stand square between Cleon Stroud and the child, and his shadow fell across the whole far wall of the room. Cleon stopped where he was. The two men looked at one another across 10 feet of plank floor. That's my daughter, Cleon said. Some of the certainty had gone out of his voice. That's so, said Zeb. You got no business with her. She's mine. She run off. Kids run off all the time. Cleon dragged the back of his hand across his wet mouth. I come to take her home where she belongs. She ain't going home. It came out of Zeb, flat and final, the sound of a heavy door swinging shut. Cleon's jaw worked. He looked around the room again, slower this time. Eben had risen now up out of his chair by the stove, and Lem had risen stiff and unhurried, and Jubal had set down his work, and his eyes had gone cold and still and level, and Rance was halfway up out of his seat, vibrating like a plucked fiddle string. 5 of them, and the biggest of them all standing dead center. A smarter man, a soberer man, would have read that room in a heartbeat and backed himself right out the door. Cleon Stroud was neither smart nor sober. You don't get to tell me what I do with my own kid, he said, and his voice climbed. You hear me? You're some mountain trash come down off the hill. You don't know me. You don't know nothing about... I know what's on her face, Zeb said. Quiet. That quiet of his that filled a room up to the rafters. She fell. She walked 3 miles barefoot through a killing storm to get away from you, Zeb said. Children don't do that for a fall. And it went fast, then the back and forth of it. 2 men trading words like blows. She's clumsy. She's terrified. She's a liar. Like her mother, always... Cleon caught himself. A half-second too late. His eyes went wide at what had nearly come out of his own mouth. And the room felt it. The whole room felt the shape of the thing he had almost said. Zeb went very, very still. Like her mother, he repeated, soft as falling snow. Now what is it you mean by that, Stroud? Don't mean nothing. Sounded like it meant a great deal. Cleon's hand twitched toward the front of his coat, and every man in that room moved. Not far, not fast, just a shift of weight, a lean, a hand drifting easy toward a belt. The silent instant decision of a room full of dangerous men all at once, and without a word among them, that whatever came out of that coat had best be a handkerchief. Cleon's hand stopped. He looked at the five of them, one by one, and at last the arithmetic of it got through the whiskey. He could not win this. Not tonight. Not in here. This ain't over, he said. He stabbed a thick finger at the child by the fire, and his voice shook with something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but was poisoned through with both. You're my blood, Lynette Stroud. You hear me, my blood. You belong to me, and I'll be back with the law, and the law will give you right back where you belong. And here was the terrible part. He was likely right, because this was cold water, and in cold water the law belonged to a certain kind of man. But that too was a story for after. For now, Cleon Stroud turned on his heel and shoved back out into the rain, and a moment later his horse went pounding off into the black. The door swung, banged, went still. Lynette had not moved the entire time. She sat by the fire with the blanket up to her chin, shaking like a leaf in a hard wind. Odessa went to her and gathered her up, and this time the child did not flinch away. This time she turned her face into the woman's shoulder and held on, and a long, deep shudder ran the length of her small body, and that finally was when she cried. Zeb stood in the middle of the room with his great fists slowly unclenching. He had not hit anyone. God forgive him, he had wanted to. He had wanted to take Cleon Stroud apart with his bare hands and scatter the pieces of him down the Sweetwater. The want had been so strong it had frightened even him. But he hadn't. Because a long time ago his fists had cost him everything he had. And he had learned up there in the cold, in the silence, that there is all the difference in the world between the thing that feels good and the thing that's right. He just hadn't reckoned on being tested on it tonight. He'd come down for salt. The hoofbeats came again maybe 20 minutes later. But these came slow, steady, the unhurried walk of a man in no fury at all, just doing a job he likely wished he didn't have to do. This time when the door opened, it was a tin star that came through it. Sheriff Asa Tarbox was 58 years old and looked every day of it, and then a good few more besides. Lean, stooped a little through the shoulders, a gray mustache and grayer eyes and a face that had spent 30 long years learning which laws to bend and which to break clean off and which to simply turn his back on. He took his wet hat off at the door, which not every lawman would have bothered to do, and he took in the room with one long, slow, careful sweep of those gray eyes. The men he did not know except by their reputation. And the reputation alone was enough to make him careful. The widow Greer holding a weeping child. And the child. His eyes landed on Lynette's face, on the swollen eye and the split lip. And Zeb, watching close, saw something move way down behind the old sheriff's gray stare. Something that had maybe been asleep a long, long time. Cleon Stroud about run me down in the street, Tarbox said. Said you folks stole his girl. Nobody stole nothing, Odessa said. She come in here on her own 2 bare feet, through that door, looking exactly like that. Tarbox came closer, slow. He lowered himself down into a crouch a little ways off from the child, not crowding her the same way Zeb had. Lynette, he said, you know me, I'm the sheriff. You remember I've been out to your place a time or two. The child nodded, wary as a wild thing. Can you tell me who put those marks on you, honey? She looked up at Odessa. Odessa gave her the smallest nod, and Lynette looked back at the old sheriff. And she said it again, the 4 words. But this time her voice did not shake. This time, somehow, with a saloon full of mountain men standing at her back, she found something steadier in herself. My pa did this. Tarbox closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, he looked tired in a way that had not one thing to do with the lateness of the hour. He stood up, his knees cracked like dry sticks, and he turned to face the room, and he was a man caught between 2 hard things, and you could read it on him plain as the rain on his coat. Because Asa Tarbox knew Cleon Stroud. Drank in the same saloon as him some nights. And more than that, he knew the man behind Cleon Stroud. He knew who Cleon owed and what and how much. He knew who held the paper on half the homesteads in this valley. He knew who had built that bright new white land office and who decided in this county which men got the protection of the law in which men got the law's back turned square on them. A sheriff who crossed that man did not stay a sheriff for long. A sheriff who crossed that man in a town like this, one did not always stay a living one. Tarbox knew every bit of that, and he looked at the little girl's face one more time. "Mr. Corliss," he said. He didn't even turn to Zeb to say it. He kept his eyes on the child. "That's your name, ain't it? Corliss, the trapper off Black Antler." "It is. I know your reputation. Most folks do." "Then you'll understand I can't just stand here and let a man like you ride off up into the hills with somebody's child." "Wasn't planning to." "And I can't in good conscience." Tarbox's voice caught on the word just slightly, like it was a word he hadn't had cause to use about himself in some while. "Send this child back out to that house tonight. Not looking the way she looks. Not with what she's saying." The room held still. This was the moment. You could feel the whole rest of the night, the whole rest of everything that was coming balanced on the point of what this tired old lawman said next. "So here's what's going to happen," Tarbox said. "The child stays here in town tonight. Somewhere safe. Not the jail. Somewhere warm." He glanced a question at Odessa. "My place," Odessa said at once. "Above the saloon. She stays with me." Tarbox nodded. "And come first light, I'm going to ride out and fetch Doc, and I'm going to have him look this child over gentle and write down every last mark on her with the date set beside it. Proper. And then," he stopped. "And then," Zeb said. The old sheriff was quiet a moment. "And then," he said, "I reckon we'll find out what kind of town we are." It wasn't much. It wasn't a vow. It wasn't an army at his back. But it was a crack. The very first crack in a wall that had stood whole and unbroken for 4 long years. And from the look on Asa Tarbox's bent face, he knew exactly what that crack might end up costing him. He set his wet hat back on his head. He moved toward the door. And there he paused, one hand on the frame, and he said it low, almost to himself, low enough that maybe only Zeb caught the whole of it. "Should have done something about that man 4 years back." A breath. "Lord, forgive me. I surely should have." And then he was gone out into the rain. So that was the shape of the thing. A child who had heard her mother die and been made to call it an accident. A father who had kept her quiet with his fists for 4 years running. And a town where the law belonged body and soul to a man whose name had not yet even been spoken aloud in that room, but whose long shadow lay across every single word that had been said in it. And one old mountain man who had come down off his hill for salt and coffee in 3 quiet days, and had found instead the one thing in all the wide world he had spent 15 years running from. A girl with marks on her, and no one to stand for her. The same as Tamsin. And this was the thought that came to Zeb Corliss as he watched Odessa carry that exhausted child up the back stairs, wrapped tight in a wool blanket, asleep against her shoulder before they reached the top step. This time he was here. This time he had not been off on some far mountain when it happened. This time he was standing right in the room. This time the girl was still breathing, still warm, still young enough to mend if anybody at all would just stand between her and the thing that meant to break her. 15 years he had believed there was nothing left inside him worth the giving. 15 years he had told himself that the world had taken his daughter and his faith and his very name and left him a hollow thing, a husk, a man best left alone, up where the cold could keep him. And here was this child, reaching down into that hollow place and finding something still alive in there after all. He did not sleep that night. He sat in a chair by the stove in the empty saloon, his old long rifle laid across his knees, and he watched the door, and he listened to the great storm finally tear itself apart and go grumbling off east toward the open plains. Eben sat up with him a good part of the night, said not one word, just sat. That was Eben to the bone. Somewhere in the small hours, Lem Stagg came down the stairs in his stocking feet, unable to find sleep himself, and lowered his old bones into the chair across from Zeb. For a long while, neither man spoke. The fire muttered between them. Then Lem said it quiet. "You know who that little girl's pa answers to, don't you?" Zeb said nothing. "Cleon Stroud ain't got 2 coins to rub together, but that man's never once wanted for whiskey, nor for land, nor for a friend up at the courthouse. You ever stop to wonder why that is?" Zeb still said nothing, but his big hands tightened on the rifle. Same man paid for that fancy new land office, Lem said. Same man owns the bank that owns half the homesteads up and down this valley. Same man decides which folks the law leaves be and which folks it don't. He leaned in, and his dried apple face was grim in the low firelight. We stand up for that little girl Zeb. We ain't just standing up to a drunk with a mean streak. We're standing up to the single most powerful man in this whole territory, and he is going to come at us with every last thing he's got. A long silence. The fire popped. You hearin' me, old friend, Lem said. This here is a far bigger fight than the one you rode down the mountain to find. And Zeb Corliss looked into the fire. And he thought about a different fire 15 years gone, and a girl he had not been able to save, and a kind of cold quiet that had lived in his chest every single day since. I hear you, Lem, he said. And Zeb turned his head, and in his eyes was a thing that had not been there in a very long while. A thing that if you had known him in the old days before the cold, you might have called by its right name. It was purpose. And I reckon, said the bear of Black Antler, it's about time somebody did. Outside, the last of the rain let go its hold on the valley. The clouds tore open in the east, and the first thin gray light of morning came creeping down off the high shoulders of Black Antler and into the dry and frightened valley of Coldwater. Up the back stairs, a little girl slept warm and safe for the first time in 4 years. Down by the fire, an old man kept the watch. And somewhere across a town, in a fine dark house, behind that bright new white land office, a powerful man was about to wake up and learn that his most useful, most controllable little secret had walked barefoot through a storm in the night and into entirely the wrong saloon. The fight was coming, and for the first time in 15 years, Zebulon Corliss was glad to be alive to meet it. Morning came to Coldwater the color of cold ash. The storm had blown itself out in the night and left the whole valley washed and shining, and somehow no less afraid. Puddles stood in the muddy street like broken pieces of fallen sky. The Sweetwater ran high and brown between its banks, and up off the eastern ridges the sun came thin and pale and uncertain the way the sun comes when it isn't sure it's welcome. Zeb Corliss had not slept a wink. He sat in the same chair by the same stove where the fire had burned down to gray coals, his rifle still across his knees, his eyes still on the door. 53 years old, and he'd kept watch the whole night through, like a young man on his first guard, and his body had a great deal to say to him about that this morning. His back, his knees, the old shoulder a grizzly's claws had opened up 20 winters back, and that had never quite forgiven him for the seasons since. He didn't care, because upstairs a child was sleeping, and she was sleeping because he was down here sitting in this chair, and that was a thing well worth a sore back and a bad shoulder. Odessa came down first, hair pinned up sleeves shoved to the elbow, that same riverboat captain steadiness about her, even at the gray edge of dawn. She looked at the dead stove, then at the big man who had not moved from his chair the whole night through. You sit there all night. Reckon I did. You're a fool then. Reckon I am that too. And the corner of her mouth went up, just that, just the one corner. She set about coaxing the fire back to life, and Zeb watched her do it, and he found he could not quite look away. There was something in it, the small, ordinary miracle of a woman building a fire on a cold morning. He had been alone up on that mountain so long he had clean forgotten such a thing existed. The shape of another person moving through a room with a purpose, the dry crack and catch of the kindling, the way she blew on the first flame, low patient, coaxing it up out of nothing. Stop that. Stop looking at her like that, you old fool. She buried one husband already. She don't need a worn-out hermit mooning at her over a cold stove. You came down for salt. He looked at the floor. She wake at all, he asked. Twice. Odessa fed a split log to the new flames. Both times screaming. Both times I held on to her till she went back down. She sat back on her heels and stared into the fire, and her jaw was set hard. 6 years old, Zeb. 6 years old when she heard her own mama die through a wall. And that man's been climbing into her room with his fists every season since. I know it. No, you don't know it. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened like a blade drawn slow over a stone. You think you know it because you can see the marks on her, but you don't sleep in the next room. You don't hear the things she says when the dreams got hold of her in the dark. She stopped. drew a breath. I do. As of last night, I do. And I will tell you right now, I am not handing that child back to anybody. I don't care a lick what the law says about it. And there it was. The fight already before the coffee had even come to a boil. Because Zeb knew a thing that Odessa had not yet let herself say out loud. The law might not give them any choice in the matter. The men stirred to life one by one. Eben from his corner where he'd dozed sitting up with his back to the wall. Jubal from the floor where he'd slept rolled in a blanket like he was still out on the trail. Rance came down the back stairs scowling the way he came down everything. And old Lem last of all moving stiff and slow, grumbling under his breath about chairs that had plainly been built by men who'd never once had to sleep in them. And then near 8 o'clock came a soft sound on the stairs. Lynette. She came down slow, one step, then the next, wrapped in a man's shirt of Odessa's that hung clear to her ankles. Her hair brushed out clean, and her face looked worse in the honest light of day, if anything. The swelling had come up purple and yellow-green around the eye. But the eyes themselves were clearer this morning. Less hunted. She had slept. She had been warm. And a child who has been warm and safe for a single night looks like a different child than one who has not. She stopped on the bottom stair. 5 of the biggest, hardest men in the whole territory, all of them, turned to look at her at once. And Rance Tully, the hothead, the boy who lived for a fight, said the gentlest thing anybody said the whole of that morning. "Mornin', Miss Lynette." And then, because he plainly did not know what else on earth to do with his hands, he held up the little antler carving Jubal had been working at the night before and had finished sometime in the dark hours and had quietly pressed into the boy's hand. It was a bird, a small, clumsy, careful bird carved up out of white bone. "It's a linnet," Rance said, going red clear to his ears. "On account of your name. Jubal here made it. We figured you ought to have it." The child looked at the little bird, and she came down the last stair and she reached out and took it, and she held it against her chest with both her hands like it had been carved from solid gold. And not one man in that room could find a single thing to say. So they fed her. That is what you do. You cannot fix the whole broken world before breakfast, but you can put hot food into a hungry child, and so they did. Odessa fried eggs, and Jubal made more of his good bread, and the men all pretended very hard not to watch the way she ate, which was a great deal slower and steadier than it had been the night before, and that was something that was a real something. And it was halfway through that breakfast that the bell over the saloon door jangled, and the second crack came into the wall. It was a sharp-dressed man, a black coat brushed clean of trail dust, a leather satchel under one arm, spectacles, and the careful, deliberate way of moving that belongs to a man who makes his living being precise. "Mrs. Greer," he said, "forgive the early hour. My name is Phineas Dabney. I'm an attorney. I ride the circuit out of the territorial court." He swept off his hat. "Sheriff Tarbox sent for me. Last night by the telegraph. He said that there was a child." Lem Stagg sat up straight in his chair. "Tarbox sent for a lawyer in the night." "He did indeed." Dabney's eyes found the little girl by the fire, and they softened, and then they hardened again, all in the same breath, which was a particular trick of his. "He said the child would need somebody to stand for her, in a court of law, before certain other parties stand against her." "What other parties?" Zeb asked. Low. Dabney turned and looked at the big man. He was not a man easily impressed. You could see that on him at once. He had faced down hard men across 100 courtroom floors. But even Phineas Dabney took a beat before he gave his answer to the bear of Black Antler. "The father will petition the court for the child's return," he said. "That much is certain. He has the right to it. She is his blood, and the law of this territory bends a long, long way toward a father." He set his satchel down on the bar. "But the father is not what concerns me this morning." "Then what does—" And Dabney said the name. For the very first time, somebody in that saloon spoke the name out loud. Lucian Penhallow. And it was as though the temperature in the whole room dropped 10 degrees all at once. Lem Stagg breathed it out like a curse. Eben's jaw set hard. Even Odessa behind the bar went still as stone. Because everyone knew the name. The way you know a thing you have always been careful never to say. Lucian Penhallow, territorial prosecutor. The man who had built the bright new white land office. The man whose bank held the paper on half the valley. the man who decided in this far corner of Wyoming territory what the law was and exactly who it was for. What in the wide world, Odessa said slowly, does the territorial prosecutor want with Cleon Stroud's little girl? And Dabney looked at her over the top of his spectacles. That, he said, is precisely the question that has kept me from my sleep since midnight. He opened his satchel. He drew out a map. A surveyor's map, all fine lines and figures, and the careful copperplate hand of the land office, and he spread it open on the bar and weighted down the curling corners with whiskey glasses. The Stroud homestead, he said, and laid one neat finger on a parcel up on the bench above the river. 160 acres, patented under the Homestead Act. Nothing the least bit remarkable about it. His finger moved. Except for this. A thin blue line snaking down out of the high ground, running right through the heart of the Stroud parcel and on down into the dying valley below. That, said Phineas Dabney, is Antelope Spring. And in a valley that has not seen a decent rain in 2 whole summers, with the creek beds cracking and the cattle dying on their feet, and the homesteaders staring up at the sky like it owes them money. Antelope Spring is the only water on this entire bench that has never, not once in living memory, run dry. Silence in the room. Whoever owns that spring, Dabney went on quiet, owns the water. And out here, gentlemen, he looked slowly around the room, whoever owns the water owns everything, every soul in this valley. The land below it is worthless dust without it. The cattle perish without it. The families starve and pull up stakes without it. A man who controls Antelope Spring controls all of them. He can let the water run or he can shut it off. He can charge whatever he pleases for it. He can drive a poor homesteading family clean off their own claim just by closing a single gate and waiting for the dry to do the rest. And now the shape of the thing was coming clear and going darker by the second. And the spring, Zeb said, very quiet. Who owns the spring? Dabney looked at the little girl by the fire. The Stroud homestead was not patented by Cleon Stroud, he said. It was patented by his wife's family, the Callaways. The water right, the legal claim to the use of that spring, it ran with the land, and by law it belonged to the wife, Morella Stroud, born a Callaway. A pause. And when she died, that right passed down. But it did not pass to her husband. He let it hang there in the morning air. It passed to her child, Dabney said. It passed to Lynette. And the whole room turned slow as one to look at the 10-year-old girl wrapped in a borrowed shirt holding a little carved bird against her chest, who had no earthly idea at all that she was sitting there atop the single most valuable thing in the territory. Zeb felt the floor shift beneath his boots, because now it all made a terrible kind of sense. The fists, the fear, the 4 years of keeping a child too frightened to so much as whisper. It had never been only a cruel man being cruel. He needs her, Zeb said, and the words came out of him like stones dropping. Stroud. He's got no claim to that spring on his own. The spring is hers, but she's a child. So whoever stands as her guardian controls that water until the day she comes of age, Dabney finished. Precisely. As her father, Cleon Stroud is her natural guardian under the law, which means that for as long as Cleon Stroud holds his daughter, Cleon Stroud holds Antelope Spring. And the very moment somebody takes that child out of his hands, he loses it, said Lem. He loses everything, Dabney agreed. And so I rather suspect does the man standing behind him. And so now they knew what it was they were truly up against. Not a drunk father wanting his daughter back. A water right worth a fortune in a valley dying of thirst, and a powerful man who meant to have it for himself, and a little girl standing square in the middle of it, the way a fawn stands frozen in a road, not yet understanding that the thing bearing down on her means to run her right over. Lynette had been listening. Children always listen. They learn to in houses like the one she came out of. She did not understand the half of what was said, but she understood enough. Is that why Mama wouldn't sign the paper? She asked. Every head in the room turned toward her. What paper, honey? Odessa said. Careful, so very careful. Lynette's brow furrowed up the way a child's does when she is reaching back into the deep fog of being very small. There was a man, she said slowly. He used to come to the house in a black coat. He'd come and he'd lay a paper on the table, and Pa would want Mama to put her name to it. And Mama wouldn't. And after the man rode off, Pa would get so mad. He'd yell that she was costing them everything in the world, that all she had to do was sign her name and we'd be rich. Her voice went small. And the night Mama died, she stopped. She stopped, and her small hands tightened around the little carved bird, and the whole room held its breath at once. The night Mama died, Lynette whispered. The man in the black coat had been there that very day, with the paper, and Mama wouldn't sign it. And that was the night she had her accident. You could have heard a feather come to rest on that floor. Phineas Dabney took off his spectacles. He cleaned them slow on his handkerchief, which Zeb would come to learn was the thing the man did when he was working very hard to keep his face from showing what was behind it. "Child," Dabney said gentle, "this man in the black coat, did your mama ever once say his name?" Lynette thought hard. "She called him a snake," she said. "I remember it. She told Pa I won't put my name to anything for that snake. That water is for Lynette, and it's for the whole valley. My daddy meant it to be shared out, and I will not hand it to a snake to dry everybody else out and starve them off their land." The child looked up, and there were tears standing bright in her eyes now, but her voice held steady the way it had held steady the night before, with the men standing at her back. "That's what Mama said. The water's for the whole valley." She said it over and over. And a thing passed across Phineas Dabney's face that Zeb would remember for a long while after. "Then your mother," the lawyer said quietly, "was a far braver soul than most grown men I have ever had the honor to know." He turned to face the room. "You understand what this child has just told us," he said. "Morella Stroud did not merely own that water. She refused to sell it, again and again, to a man powerful enough to make the refusing of him a fatal thing to do. And she had her reason." He looked at Lynette. "She meant for that spring to be shared, with the whole valley. That, my friends, is a rare and unheard of thing, a water right worth a fortune, and a woman who wished to give it away to her struggling neighbors rather than sell it for a king's ransom to a rich man. Which is exactly the kind of woman," Lemstag said slowly, "that a greedy man simply cannot abide to leave standing." "Which is exactly the kind of woman," Dabney agreed, "who is found dead at the foot of her own loft stairs with a doctor's report that says she fell." And Zeb Corliss, standing there by the cold stove with the gray morning light coming in at the windows, felt the old ice in his chest crack clean through, because he had seen this shape before. Not the spring, not the valley, but the shape of it. The shape of a powerful man deciding that one inconvenient life was worth less than the thing he wanted, and the law lying down quiet at his polished boots, and the truth getting buried deep in the same hole as the body. He had seen that shape. He had lived down inside it for 15 years. It was Eben who pulled him back. Eben Marsh, who used one word where other men used 10, crossed the room and laid one big steady hand on Zeb's shoulder. "Zeb," he said, "just the name, just the once," and it was enough. Zeb hauled himself up out of the old country by main strength, the way you drag a drowning man up out of a river by the collar, and he was here again in Greer's saloon in the gray morning with a living child sitting by the fire. "I'm all right," he said. He was not, but he said it, because this was the thing he understood now, standing in that room with his old friend's hand on his shoulder. The same machine that had failed his Tamsin 15 years ago was running again, right here, in this valley. A powerful man, a buried truth, a child no one would stand for. Except this time. This time, Zeb was standing right in the room when it happened. And this time, by God, he was not going to be too late. The morning got worse before it got any better. Mornings of that kind always do. Sheriff Tarbox came back around 9. He'd been out to the docks, and Doc had ridden in and looked the child over as gentle as such a thing can be done, and written it all down. Every mark, every bruise, with the date set careful beside each one. Proper, just like Tarbox had said. And it was the first honest thing the law of Coldwater had done about Cleon Stroud in 4 years. And the old sheriff wore the look of a man who has just stepped off a high cliff in the dark and is waiting to find out how far down the bottom is. Because by 10 o'clock, the answer came riding into town. Not Cleon. Cleon was not the one who mattered, and Cleon knew it better than anybody. It was a carriage. A fine black carriage, glossy and clean, even through all that mud drawn by a matched pair of bays. It rolled up the street and stopped in front of the bright new land office, and a man stepped down out of it. Zeb watched him from the saloon window. Lucian Penhallow was nothing at all like Cleon Stroud. That was the first thing about him. Where Stroud was thick and red and loud, Penhallow was lean and pale and quiet. A beautiful gray coat, silver at the temples. A face that smiled easily and meant not a word of it. He moved through the muddy street without seeming to get a speck of the mud on him, the way certain men move through the whole of the world without ever seeming to be touched by it. He did not come to the saloon. Men like Penhallow do not come to you. They send for you, or else they simply wait, and the world rearranges itself to carry you to them. But he paused there a moment on the boardwalk in front of his land office, and he looked across the street, right at Greer's, right at the window where Zeb stood watching him. And he smiled. It was a small smile, a patient smile. The smile of a man who has never once in his life lost and does not expect to begin now. And then he turned and went inside, and the door of the land office shut behind him. "He saw you," Lem said at Zeb's shoulder. "He saw all of us. And he ain't worried." The old man's voice was low and grim. "That's the thing that frightens me, Zeb. He just laid eyes on 5 mountain men and a circuit lawyer and the whole town watching, and he ain't worried even a little bit, which means he's already got himself a plan, and it's already moving." Zeb said nothing, but he knew Lem was right, and he was righter than either of them yet knew. The petition came that afternoon. A boy ran it across the muddy street, all sealed and stamped, and official. Cleon Stroud, by his attorney, and the attorney was one of Penhallow's own men. Of course, a slick young fellow in a checked vest petitioned the territorial court for the immediate return of his minor daughter, Lynette Stroud, unlawfully detained. And there was more. The petition also requested, and here Phineas Dabney read it through twice, and his face went pale, that pending the hearing, the court appoint a temporary guardian to manage the minor child's property and water interests. And it named that guardian Lucian Penhallow. "He isn't even troubling to hide it," Dabney breathed. "He means to use the court itself to seize the spring outright. He'll have himself named guardian of her water for the child's own protection, and once that ink is dry on the page, it will not matter one whit who holds the girl. He'll have the water, lawfully, with the court's own blessing upon it." "Can he do that?" Odessa demanded. "He is the territorial prosecutor," Dabney said. "He has friends on every bench between here and Cheyenne. So, yes, he can certainly try, and before the wrong judge." He did not finish. "Then we need the right judge," Zeb said. "There is one." Dabney was already gathering up his papers. "Judge Whitcomb. He rides the Northern Circuit. An honest man by every account I've ever heard, and not in Penhallow's pocket. But he's 200 miles off, and the roads are a sea of mud, and the hearing has been set for 3 days, hence which is exactly enough time for the crooked judge to ride in, and not nearly enough for the honest one." The lawyer's jaw set hard. Penhallow chose the date. Of course he did. He chooses everything in this county. So that was the lay of it. 3 days, a crooked court racing in toward them, and an honest one too far away to come. A powerful man reaching out his pale hand, calm as a Sunday morning, to take a little girl's only inheritance and dry out a whole valley to do it. And there in the middle of it all sat one little girl who had carried a piece of bone carved like a bird up to bed with her, and who still did not fully grasp that the men in the fine coats meant to ruin her entirely. That afternoon, Zeb did a thing he had not planned to do. He went and sat with her. She was up in the small room above the saloon in the window, with the little carved bird on the sill in front of her, and her chin on her arms, looking out at the muddy street and the mountains beyond it. Zeb pulled a chair over careful and lowered himself into it, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. That suited Zeb fine. He was easier with silence than with words. "That's Black Antler," he said at last, and pointed his big chin at the high gray peak standing over the valley. "Where I live, up near the top of it. All by yourself." "All by myself." Lynette considered the mountain. "Ain't you lonesome?" And Zeb opened his mouth to say no, because the answer had always been no. The answer had been no for 15 years. The mountain was not lonesome. The mountain was peace. The mountain was the one place in all the world where nothing could reach in and hurt him anymore. "I used to say no," he said instead, and it surprised him hearing it come out of his own mouth. Used to be, I'd have told you the mountain was the finest company a man could ask for. The wind, the elk in the high meadows, the way the snow comes down so quiet at night you can hear your own heart beating. But he looked at her, this sharp little thing who heard the word underneath the words same as he did. But I reckon a man can get so used to being alone, he said slowly, that he forgets it's even a thing he chose, forgets there was ever anything else. And then sometimes, he stopped. He didn't have the words for it. He had been alone too long to have the words. Sometimes you remember, Lynette said. Yeah, Zeb said. Sometimes you remember. She picked up the little bird and turned it over in her small hands. My mama used to sing, she said. In the mornings, when she was cooking, she had a song about a little bird that flew over the mountains looking for spring. She was quiet a moment. Pa made her stop after a while, said it gave him a headache, so she'd just hum it real quiet so only I could hear. And then she died, and there wasn't any more singing in the house. Not ever. Zeb sat very still. What did the little bird find, he asked. In the song, when it flew over the mountains, Lynette thought. I don't remember the end, she admitted. I was real small. I just remember it kept flying and flying, looking for spring. And Zeb Corliss, who had not wept in 15 years, had to look hard out that window at the gray mountain for a good long while before he trusted his voice again. Well, he said finally, birds are tougher than they look. I expect it found it. That night the men made their plan. They sat around the stove in the closed and shuttered saloon, and they argued, and the argument was the same argument. It had always been the oldest argument. There is the argument between the two things a man can choose to be. We don't sit here waiting 3 days on any court, Rance Tully said. He was up and pacing fire in every word. We don't sit on our hands while that snake in the land office cooks up his papers. You want to know what I think? I think 4 of us ride out tonight, and we go and have a word with Cleon Stroud, and then we go and have a word with Lucian Penhallow, and we settle this thing the way the West has always settled things. And then what? Zeb said. And then it's settled. And then it's murder, Lem said flatly. And then every lawman between here and the territory line has himself a reason to hunt us down. And then that snake gets to be a martyr in his own newspaper, and that little girl ends up in the county orphan asylum while the courts sort out who they're going to hang. That's your plan, boy. It's better than losing. It is losing, Zeb said. Quiet. That quiet of his that filled the whole room. And Rance rounded on him, and here it came, the thing that had plainly been building up behind the boy's eyes for years. Is it, Rance said, or is it just easy? You know what they say about you, old man, down in the trapping camps. They say the bear used to be something once. They say there was a time the bear of Black Antler would have walked straight into that land office and walked back out again, and the problem would have walked out right alongside him. They say something happened to you a long way back, and it broke whatever it is inside a man that lets him do the hard thing when the hard thing needs doing. They say now you just hesitate. They say now you'd sooner sit by a fire and let the lawyers lose it slow than stand up on your own 2 feet and win it fast. The room went dead still. Eben rose halfway up out of his chair, but Zeb lifted one hand. Just the one. And Eben sat back down. And Zeb Corliss looked at the angry young man for a long, long moment. And then he told him the thing he had never told a single one of them, the thing he had carried up the mountain and kept there in the cold and the silence, the thing the silence had been holding for 15 years. I had a daughter, Zeb said. The fire popped. Nobody breathed. Her name was Tamsin. She'd be older than you now, Rance, if she'd lived. She didn't live. He looked into the flames. Her mother died bringing her into the world, and I raised her the best a rough fur man knew how, which was poorly because the mountains kept calling me, and the trade kept calling me, and I was gone. So gone. So often gone. And she grew up while my back was turned, and she took up with a man, a hard man, charm in the daylight and a fist in the dark. And when I finally come down off a winter's trapping and saw what he'd done to my girl, I went to the law about it in a fury fit to burn the world to the ground. A long pause. His huge hands were knotted together between his knees. And the law looked at me, he said, a poor mountain man with dirt under his nails. And then the law looked at his family, a rich family, a fine family, with a fine house and a fine name. And the law decided. It didn't even take them long. They decided in an afternoon that my girl's word wasn't worth as much as a rich man's good name. No charges, no trial, nothing at all. His voice had gone rough as gravel. And my Tamsin learned that day that the world had weighed her and found her worth less than nothing. And she could not carry the weight of knowing that. And I was 300 miles up a mountain when it took her from me. He stopped. He did not finish. He could not finish. Some griefs a man carries to his grave with the last of it left unspoken. By the time I got down off that mountain, he said she was gone. And I never once got to stand for her. Never got to be in the room when it mattered. I was too late. I have always my whole life been too late. He turned and looked at Rance, and his eyes were wet, and his voice when it came was not angry at all. It was the saddest thing in all the world. You think I hesitate because I'm broken inside, he said. Maybe I am broken, but I will tell you why I won't ride out there tonight and put a bullet through Cleon Stroud much as that bullet wants the throwing. It's because I have learned, son, the hard and the bloody way that violence is the easy thing. Any fool can throw a punch. Any fool can pull a trigger. I have buried the easy way. What's hard, what is near impossible, is keeping a child safe and alive and free for the whole rest of her natural life. And you do not do that with a gun. You do it with patience and with proof and by staying, by being in the room this time. His voice broke just barely. I was not in the room for my Tamsin. I am going to be in the room for this one. And I will not hand Lucian Penhallow the gift of making us into the very thing he says we are. Do you hear me, Rance? That snake wins the very second we become the criminals he's already calling us. And Rance Tully, the hothead, the boy who loved to fight, stood there in the firelight with his fists slowly opening up. And he sat down. And after a while, in a much smaller voice, he said, I didn't know about your girl, Zeb. I'm sorry. I never knew. Course you didn't, Zeb said. I never told a living soul, but you do now. So they did not ride out that night. They held. They planned. Dabney would race the clock to get a rider through to the honest judge up north. Lem would dig into the bank's paper every loan in Lean Penhallow held, looking for the one loose thread to pull that might unravel the whole of it. Jubal would go and find the doctor who had written that false report 4 years back and learn whether the man's conscience had grown any heavier with the carrying of it. And Zeb and Eben and Rance would do the one thing the three of them were truly built for. They would stand guard over the child. Because Lem had been right about Penhallow, the man had a plan and it was already moving. It moved the very next morning. Lem had gone first before dawn down to the bank under the pretext of asking after a loan. His old eyes reading every ledger they would let him near and a few they wouldn't. He came back grim. Penhallow holds the paper on near 40 homesteads in this valley, he said, all of them downstream of that spring. He's been buying up the debt for 2 years quiet through the bank. 2 years, Zeb, since right around the time Morella Stroud went down those stairs. He shook his old head. He's been planning this since before she was cold. The spring was always the prize. The little girl is just the key to the lock. And Jubal had ridden out to the docks at first light and come back quiet and thoughtful. The doctor's an old man, he said in that soft Creekwater voice. Sick, dying, I judge by the look of him, and carrying something heavy. I didn't push him. You don't push a thing like that. But I planted a seed. Told him there was a little girl in town now telling the truth at last, and asked did he want to meet his maker with that report still on his conscience, or off it. Jubal looked into the fire. He didn't answer me. But he didn't throw me out neither. A dying man's got less reason to be afraid than most. We'll see. It was all coming together, slow the way honest things come together. The thread, the witness, the rider gone north for the judge. And it might have worked, except it moved while they were watching the front of the house and not the back. While they were watching the law and not the lawless. While Phineas Dabney was 3 hours out of town riding hard for the Northern Circuit, and Lem was bent over the last of his ledgers, and Jubal was gone again out to the docks to sit with the old man's conscience, and the watch had thinned just for an hour, just for one careless hour. Odessa had taken Lynette down the street to the general store. Just down the street, broad daylight, to buy the child a proper dress and a proper pair of shoes, Because the one thing on God's earth Odessa Greer could not abide was that little girl going about in a borrowed man's shirt one single day longer. And Zeb had let them go. He would watch them the whole way from the saloon window, he had told himself. 50 yards, broad daylight, the whole town up and awake. What in the world could happen in 50 yards of broad daylight? He found out. He was at the window. He saw them go in the door of the store. He turned away just for a moment, just to take the coffee Eben was holding out to him, and when he looked back, there was a wagon. A wagon he did not know, pulled up tight against the side wall of the general store in the narrow alley, where the angle of the building hit it clean from the saloon window. And Zeb's gut turned to ice water. He was moving before he knew he was moving. Out the door, into the street, the coffee cups shattering on the floorboards behind him. Odessa! But the wagon was already pulling out. Fast. 3 men. And in the bed of it, under a canvas tarp, a shape that thrashed and fought, and a smaller shape that did not move at all, and Odessa's voice cut off short in the middle of a scream, and the wagon hit the end of the street and was gone around the bend toward the river road, toward the open country and the breaks beyond. Zeb stood in the middle of the muddy street, his great chest heaving, his hands empty at his sides, the whole town frozen and staring at him. And he understood in that single terrible breath exactly what Lucian Penhallow had done. He had not waited for the court. The court was only ever for show. The court was to keep Zeb and his men looking the wrong way, watching the wrong door, while the real thing happened in an alley in broad daylight. He had simply taken the child, and taken the woman who had tried to protect her. And now they were gone out into 200 miles of wild and lawless country, into the canyons and the breaks, where a wagon could vanish like smoke, and a man could do anything he pleased and call it whatever he liked once it was done. Lem came out the door behind him, saw the empty street, saw the big man standing there shaking in the middle of it. Zeb, he said. Zeb, we'll track him. Jubal can track a fish through water. But Zeb wasn't listening. Because for one wild, white, roaring moment, every single word he had said by the fire the night before, about patience, about proof, about not becoming the thing Penhallow said they were, every last word of it burned clean away to ash. For one moment, the bear of Black Antler wanted nothing in all the world but to ride straight to that fine dark house and tear it apart stone by stone with his bare hands. He shut his eyes. He stood there in the muddy street, 53 years old, and he made himself breathe. Because that was exactly what Penhallow wanted. Wasn't it? That was the whole of it. He wanted Zeb to lose his head, to ride off wild and stupid and become the very criminal the man was already calling him, to hand him the perfect excuse. Patience. Proof. Be in the room. You were too late for Tamsin. Don't you dare be too late for this one. And don't you dare be a fool for her either. Zeb opened his eyes. Jubal, he said. His voice came out terrible and calm, calmer than the storm inside him had any right to make it. Where's Jubal? Riding in. Lem was already pointing. They're a rider coming hard down the river road, having seen the dust rise, having heard the scream carry thin across the morning air. Jubal Pryor, the finest tracker in the whole Wind River range, galloping in toward them, with his eyes already down on the ground, already reading the cut of the wagon's wheels in the soft mud before he had even hauled up. That wagon left a track, Zeb said, swinging his great bulk up onto the smoke-gray mule. And there is not a man alive who can read a track the way Jubal Pryor reads a track. So we don't ride wild, we don't ride angry, we ride smart, and we ride together and we bring them home. He looked at his men, Eben mounting up beside him, steady as bedrock, Rance white-faced and for once in his life saying not a single word, old Lem scrambling onto his horse. Mount up, we're going. He turned the mule toward the river road, and then he stopped, because a small, cold voice spoke up in the back of his mind, and the voice said, this is the trap. This is the thing the man does. He takes the thing you love, and he dangles it out in front of you, and he leads you off into the wild country where there is no law, and there are no witnesses, and he gets you exactly precisely where he wants you. He knew beyond any doubt that it was a trap. He was going to ride into it anyway. Because there was a child in the bed of that wagon, a child who had carried a little carved bird up to bed, a child who had asked him just yesterday whether he was lonesome on his mountain and heard the truth he hadn't even known he was telling. And a woman A woman who built a fire on a cold morning and made the corner of her mouth go up and made him feel for the first time since the world had hollowed him clean out seen. Zeb, Eben said quietly at his side. It's a trap. I know it is. You are going anyway. I am. Eben nodded, once, and the keel turned with the storm the way it always had 20 winters running. Then we're going too, Eben said. All of us, same as ever. The five of them turned their horses toward the river road, toward the open country, toward the canyons, and the breaks where Lucian Penhallow had laid his trap and now sat waiting to spring it. And as they rode out of cold water into the pale, cold afternoon, Zeb Corliss did a thing he had not done in 15 years. He prayed. He had no fine words for it. He was a rough man, and his God was a rough God, the God of the high places and the hard winters and the long silences. But he bowed his great head down over the neck of that mule, and he said it plain. Lord, I was too late once. I have carried it every single day since, like a stone in my chest. I don't ask you for much, and I haven't asked you for anything in a long while. But don't let me be too late again. Not for that little girl, not for the woman. Just let me be in time. Just this once in my life. Let me get there in time. Let me be in the room. The wind came down off Black Antler, cold and clean and smelling of the high country. And the five riders went down into the breaks after the wagon into the lawless country, into whatever it was that waited for them out there. The trap closing quietly behind them as they rode. The breaks swallowed them whole. Down off the bench, the land tore itself open into a great maze of red rock and dry wash in Blind Canyon. The kind of country a wagon rolls into and is never seen to roll out of, the kind of country that has hidden 1,000 sins down the years and never once given a single one of them back. The long afternoon light went gold and merciless across the stone, and the five riders went down into it single file, with Jubal Pryor in the lead bent low over his horse's neck, reading the ground beneath him. He read it the way other men read scripture. Wagons running heavy, Jubal said, not lifting his eyes from the dirt. 3 men, same as I figured. Moving fast but careful. They know this ground well. A pause. His finger traced the air just above a wheel rut. And they ain't the least bit worried about being followed. Why not? Rance asked. Because they want to be. And there it was again, the trap, spoken plain into the still air. Zeb said nothing. He rode. His great hands lay easy on the reins, and his face was as still as the red rock around them. But down inside, the old man was praying with every fall of the mule's hooves. Let me be in time. Let me be in time. Don't let me be too late. Not again. Not again. Not this one, too. They found the place near dusk. An old line cabin hunched down low in a box canyon with only one way in and one way out. The way a man builds a thing when he wants it easy to defend and hard to leave. Smoke rising thin from the stone chimney. Horses standing at the rail. And lamplight in the one small window, warm and yellow. And so wrong, so terribly wrong in all that cold, dead red rock. Jubal counted the horses at the rail. More than 3 now. His soft voice dropped lower. They got friends waiting here. 5, maybe 6 in all. And we're 5, said Rance. We're 5, Eben agreed. Steady, like it was nothing more than a number on a page. Zeb sat his mule at the mouth of the canyon and looked at that one lit window, and he did the thing he had spent 15 hard years learning how to do. He did not ride straight in. Every fiber in his great body was screaming at him to ride straight in. There was a child in that cabin. There was Odessa in that cabin. And the bear of Black Antler could tear a door off its hinges and tear the men behind it apart just the same. But 6 men with rifles in a cabin with one window and one door holding 2 hostages. Ride in wild and they put a bullet in the hostages first thing. Or they shoot the horses out from under his men in the open mouth of the canyon. And then it is a slaughter in the dark. And then the little girl ends up exactly where Penhallow wants her, and Odessa Greer ends up in the cold ground. Patience. He hated it. God above, how he hated it. But he had buried the alternative. He had buried it under a name carved into a wooden cross, 15 long years gone. Here is how we do it, Zeb said low, gathering his 4 men in close in the falling dark. And he laid it out for them. Quiet, careful. The way you lay out a thing you know you only get the one chance at. He would go in alone. No, Rance instantly. Hear me out. You go in there alone, they shoot you down where you stand. They want me alive, Zeb said. Think on it a minute. Penhallow doesn't want the bear of Black Antler shot dead in a canyon where I might just turn into a legend that folks tell their grandchildren. He wants me to come to him. He wants me to walk in there and lay down so that he can make the whole thing look proper afterward. Some crazed old mountain recluse rode out and got himself killed resisting the law. That's the story the man is writing in his head right now. Zeb's eyes went hard in the dusk. So I am going to give him the first half of it. I walk in, unarmed, hands held high where they can see them. And while every last pair of eyes in that cabin is fixed on the great big fool who just walked in and handed himself over, he looked at Jubal, at Eben, at Rance, and old Lem. You come in quiet, the back of it, the window, wherever Jubal finds the soft spot in their watch, and you get to that child and that woman, and you get them out. That is the whole of the mission. You do not stay and fight for me. You fight for them. You understand me, the girl in Odessa. Everything else that happens in there is just noise. Silence in the dark canyon. The wind moved through the rocks above them. And what happens to you? Rance said. Quiet now, scared now for all his fire. And Zeb Corliss smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had made his peace a long time ago with a great many hard things. I have been ready to die for 15 years, son, he said. Be a fine thing at the end of it to finally do it for a reason. He handed Eben his long rifle. He handed Lem his belt knife. And he walked unarmed, 53 years old, down into the dark of the box canyon toward the lit cabin and the men in it who meant to see him dead. He walked the way he had ridden down off the mountain, slow and